Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fuel Poverty Action series of monthly learning sessions, Fuel Thought from Fuel Poverty to Climate Justice. Our space to share research and lived experience, tackle lies, and clear up confusion on fuel poverty and climate change, as we ask and answer questions with experts, activists, campaigners, and you, everyone else who's with us tonight. As you already know, today's session is Retrofit for the Future, our fourth learning session to expand on the meaning of retrofitting for residents, workers, and the planet. And this evening, we hope to answer a few meaty questions. What does retrofitting mean? Is it expensive? And who should pay for what? Can retrofitting relieve fuel poverty, tackle energy debt, improve well-being, and reduce the impact of housing on the climate? What does safe insulation look like for residents, workers, and the planet? How do we ensure safe insulation is installed after removing dangerous cladding? What are the benefits of retrofitting, not demolishing homes? How has the government run down refurb projects? And finally, how can we organise to retrofit homes across the UK? Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. That is Scott McAulay, who's going to talk a little bit about, he's going to sort of give us a broad introduction to retrofitting and go into more detail of how it can be more climate just. Scott is an architectural practitioner and environmental activist, leading in bridging the gaps between architecture, environmentalism, the just transition, and working class struggle in the UK. Through his Anthropocene Architecture School, he teaches, as well as supports tenants' unions with retrofit campaigns. Scott was a co-founder of Architects Climate Action Network Scotland, is a co-producer of Scotland's Architecture Fringe, and works with Architype, where they specialise in life cycle analysis and sustainability coordination. Scott, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let's get this rolling, and I can slow down more than normal, which is quite nice as well. So just to double check, this has come up clean and okay? Everything's all right on that front? Perfect. So yeah, so my name's Scott, I use he and they. I'm an architectural practitioner and do quite a lot in the realms of sustainability, retrofit, life cycle analysis, but also kind of the bringing that knowledge into community groups. So what I really wanted to do with this, I was really honoured to be asked, is just to give a bit of an introduction to what do we mean when we say we want to retrofit a building, and also how does this link to climate change, fuel poverty, and otherwise? Because yeah, there's so much to this. This in itself could go on for days. So I've just kept this nice, snappy, brief, and quite broad as well. So the work that I do is very, very, very broad. It's everything from cultural production to teaching in academic spaces to on the top right-hand side with Scotland's first ever People's Assembly on climate and housing justice. I've done kind of residencies as well, which I did one earlier last year. I went through to Brussels for European Sustainable Energy Week to talk about the kind of just transition side of energy efficiency, and I helped to programme Retrofit Reimagined as well, which is a festival across the UK. So that's just a bit of what I do at the Anthropocene Architecture School, but just to kind of talk about the other hats loosely because I wear quite a few. For Architype, I do work on kind of low carbon buildings, explicitly looking at the life cycle analysis and retrofit, and also pushing design beyond sustainable. With Architects Climate Action Network Scotland, we're kind of trying to push for the policy change that we need to see, because we know that we have the technologies we need to do safe, warm, comfortable, healthy housing, and it's political and cultural barriers holding that back. It's not a technical problem. I also do quite a lot of the architecture fringe and stewarded radical spaces and autonomous actions last year, and I also helped with Living Rent's Just Transition for Tenants campaign around COP26. So I do quite kind of broad scale, a lot of different things. But the reason we're here is to really introduce retrofit broadly. So retrofit is not simply throwing insulation at buildings. That's the kind of very, very simplified version, but it's a really carefully considered adaptation and upgrade of the built environment. In terms of housing, this means that we upgrade homes in ways that reduce energy demand, reduce the heating demand, and reduce carbon emissions all at the same time. So energy efficiency is a really big part of that. So that demand reduction is something that I'm going to touch upon quite a bit. But also, it's not just about lowering energy bills. As retrofitting homes is also about meeting people's needs. So it's also making them more accessible. It's also making them healthier as well. So retrofit is a very broad term, but in the terms of housing, this is loosely what we mean. And this can look many, many, many different ways because there is no one silver bullet solution to the retrofit of buildings. It looks different in buildings built before the 1920s to buildings built post-war to more kind of recent buildings. So these are a couple of examples. On the right-hand side, there's 107 Nidri Road in Glasgow. So this is a tenement that's been retrofitted to the Enerfit standard. So lots of different things have been done to this. So retrofitting is also about improving the energy systems that are in that building. It's about looking at how it works in terms of water. It can be about repair as well. It's not just, well, retrofit usually begins with maintenance. Retrofit's a massive maintenance issue as well. But these are very, very different things. And there is no kind of one thing we can throw at every single building at the same time to make it all work the same way, because then we'll have unintended consequences of buildings performing differently. But this ties into fuel poverty very, very, very heavily because in the UK, we have some of the worst housing stock in Europe. And we've seen this in recent years. So 2 winters ago, we had thousands and thousands of people died as a result of cold homes directly. And this, we know that it's directly because of cold homes. And every single person that passes away from fuel poverty is an entirely avoidable death. And we know that the existence of fuel poverty in 2024, when we have the technologies that we have today, is an entirely political decision. This should not be happening. Fuel poverty would not exist if politics was to change its mind and act in people's best interests. But then we see on the right-hand side that whilst I was putting together another presentation, Retrofit Reimagined, Rishi Sunak scrapped the Energy Efficiency Task Force. So the government is actively hindering its own already lackluster response. As it's developing a response, it's making that response worse. So this task force was barely around for 6 months before it was wound down and made useless. And also when we look at the government schemes that have happened in the past, lots of people have had negative experiences when they were given a one measure type of home improvement which wasn't carried out properly. There wasn't a proper duty of care from the government exercised. And the most recent scheme, which is going to be the Great British Insulation Scheme, was calculated to would have taken 300 years to meet the government targets they'd set themselves. So we're currently in a cascading climate and ecological crisis where we've been told we have decades to mitigate the worst of climate change. And our government's best effort was going to take 300 years. And if something takes you 300 years to do, it's quite blatant you're not very serious about actually trying to do it in the first place, especially when this is actively killing people. And also, the insulation targets were rolled back as well. So it has been calculated over the next 10 years, with these being taken away, renters are going to pay an extra £8 billion. And again, we have the technology for that not needing to happen. And this is, again, the political landscape is making things worse than they already are. But at the same time, retrofit could be transformational climate action. So because of the impact of the built environment to climate change, if we retrofit and improve buildings, we can do some incredible things. So that's something that gives me a lot of hope is what's actually possible. So if we're going to talk about climate change and we're going to talk about buildings, 1/3 of all the energy that we use as a planet is used in buildings. And we also know that we can reduce the amount of energy we use as a civilization by between 40 to 70% just by applying energy efficiency to what we already have. So 1/3 of all the energy that we use, we could reduce that to 40 to 70%, and retrofit is a giant part of that. And on the right-hand side, about 38% of all of the carbon emissions that come from humanity come from the construction, the operation, and the maintenance of buildings. So roughly about between 40 and 50% of all the carbon emitted on the planet is around buildings, construction, operation, and maintenance. So that's a huge, huge impact. It's very negative, has a very, very negative impact. But if we actually looked at it as an opportunity, it's pretty much dreamlike. It's incredible what we could be doing. And the urgency of this could not be higher. So we were also told last year that by 2026, the UK and EU 27 construction sector is going to blow its 1.5 degrees carbon budget. So we know that on the trajectory that we're on, we're going to use up our fair share in the UK, and everything used beyond that is essentially colonisation afresh. We also know that 80% of the buildings we're going to use in 2050 are already standing up, and it saves about 50 to 70% of carbon emissions if you retrofit a building instead of knocking it down and rebuilding it, even to the highest of standards. And we also know that in the UK, 50,000 buildings are demolished every single year. So if you average that out, that's about 1 every 10 minutes. So by the time that this finishes, about 12 buildings will be knocked down on average. So that's just to put into context how many buildings we are wiping out when we're in the middle of a housing crisis. And the UK's housing stock is really clearly, visibly some of the worst performing in Europe. So we are, on average, a UK home loses 3 times more heat overnight than homes in Germany. And that's about twice as fast as homes in Italy. So we have the worst performing, and we know this. There is no way of sidestepping this in terms of policy. We could change this very easily, but it's simply not being taken seriously. We have a culture that does not guarantee the maintenance of buildings. We have a legal system that does not guarantee the maintenance and the upgrade of buildings as well. But this ties into fuel poverty and health very, very strongly in the UK, because as the weather changes and gets hotter in the summer, wetter in the winter, our buildings are not prepared to be durable and to last and to perform healthily or comfortably in those conditions. So this is something that's of the utmost urgency in terms of not just fighting the climate crisis, but looking after public health as well. But we also know what's possible. So to make things really simple, I'm going to reduce this just to talk about units. So the lower the unit, the lower the heating demand of a building. The higher, the worse. So this graph on the right-hand side shows you how poorly performing the UK housing stock is. And the average new build in the UK will typically use about 90 units, give or take. But that's in comparison to the Passive House standard, which is a standard of high-performance building, which uses 15. So that's the average new build in the UK is 5 to 6 times worse than what's already possible. And the average new build is about kind of 3 or 4, is 3 times less efficient than retrofitting a building to some of the highest standards that we're already able to do. And so that's kind of where we are. The UK is 30 years behind in terms of performance and our policy, and we know it's possible. It's already being done across Europe. We have some cases of it in the UK as well. And to be incredibly blunt, because we have to stress this every single time, retrofitting homes literally saves lives. This is no way hyperbole, this is not an exaggeration. And even though that we know retrofitting homes saves lives and that our standards are not very good in the UK, the government has chosen to actually reduce the standards in terms of their new future homes plans. They're going to get worse. But it's already been calculated by the BRE that if all of the remedial work that we know needs to be done on our housing was done, it would pay for itself back in the full societal cost in 1 year. So we know that poor housing is costing the NHS £1.4 billion. If all that retrofit work was carried out, it would pay itself back in 1 year only. And our government has known this for 2 years and has not acted on it accordingly. But we've already had some great research has been done to see where are the costs of poor housing felt, and that's everywhere from high bills to transportation, this wider systemic costs. But I'll send along some stuff on this afterwards, because this alone could be gone into for days. And just to make that very succinct, it's been worked out that 40% of any nation's healthcare costs are directly attributable to its built environment. So what it's built from, how it's maintained or not maintained, and if it's upgraded or not. So 40% of what our NHS spends is entirely down to the built environment around us. And that can be changed. We know we've got the technology to change that. And we can't talk about housing, we can't talk about retrofitting without coming into mentioning Grenfell Tower and the tragedy that was, and how that was allowed to happen through total systemic failure at every single possible opportunity. But it has been stressed that the government has seen what happens when this is not taken seriously and things have not changed in terms of policy. We need a radical change to policy, and we need lots of mobilisation and organising to make that happen as well, because it is not going to simply change by itself. And to talk about the impact of how far this was felt, so roughly 8% of all the housing in England and Wales was affected by the exposing of what happened in Grenfell Towers. That's about 4.2 million people. But we also know that there are still 342,000 flats that are still dangerous. And we know that only out of those 2.3 million, only around about 32,000 have actually had anything done to fix them. And if this is going to be done properly, it's an opportunity to make people's homes healthier and reduce their bills. But it cannot be done using the same types of insulation that we know are dangerous, because we know they are dangerous. So that's just kind of setting the scene. I'm not going to talk about it too much because I know that the folk at MedAct are going to touch upon insulation, so I'm going to keep that part to myself. But at the same time, we cannot talk about retrofitting, housing, and energy without talking about where our energy comes from. So Barnabas Calder, who's an architectural historian, really a fantastic individual, really surmised it incredibly well. So he described it as form follows fuel. So that means that what we build is shaped by our access to energy, the energy infrastructure we already use, and also what's happening and beyond that as well. So in the United Kingdom, the reason that we are seeing so many more issues of mold, damp, fuel poverty, etc., is because our cost of energy is skyrocketing because of profiteering. But at the same time, our energy was made artificially cheap because we were going to places previously colonized and exporting that back at not paying for it for its true cost. So because we are no longer having access to cheap energy that was for colonial means, we are now paying a cost that's now being driven up. But because we've designed homes to be comfortable when you use lots of heating, they are costing us avoidably more. So this has been a kind of convergence of lots of things happening at once. But retrofit is also probably one of the biggest possible just transition opportunities we have accessible to us as a society. Again, it's dreamlike. I get excited talking about it. It's incredible just how big the change we could make to people's lives. So this is an example from my home city, Glasgow, that I love a lot. These are the Woodside flats in Maryhill. And because of a retrofit that was designed in such a way that nobody had to be decanted, one man has not had to pay heating bills for 2 years. Just imagine how big a change to someone's life that is when for 2 years you are not stressing about heating, you are not considering the cost that is because you don't have to turn the heating on. And the thing is, this is replicable. This could be done on every similar block of flats across the United Kingdom. And it simply hasn't been picked up yet, but it could be. We know how to do it, it can be done. And in ways this could be done differently, we really need to start looking beyond the individual home scale because all of our government policy is basically dictated around households, not around collectives. So it's looking at house by house by house instead of street by street, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood. So we really need to flip that. But we also need that kind of from the individual to the collective. But we also, at the moment, we get these schemes that last a year. And if the money isn't spent, the government takes it back. We need to start looking far, far, far into the future with this and avoiding the extractive business models that we've seen where people are pushed into things without being given proper protections. Again, all of these are an hour-long, very happy chat in itself. I'll just keep on going and we can talk about them later. But just to put that in a scale of how many jobs retrofitting could create, how much needs to be done. So the Passive House Trust calculated that in 2020, we needed one retrofit completed every 35 seconds. It's probably much, much shorter now because we kind of haven't done that properly. So if 4 people were to be employed full time doing 500,000 simultaneous retrofits, we would need to have 2 million people employed from now until 2050. That's a workforce half the size of the NHS, of good, well paying, sustainable, consistent. If they were unionized jobs, it'd be dreamlike, it'd be magical, but that's 2 million people, and only 135,000 people were in that field in 2020. So we have 2 million jobs that we know that if we want to hit our climate targets in 2050, they need to be done. So what does that look like in terms of comparing it to other industries? Well, so for every one person employed in oil and gas in the UK in 2020, there were 3 potential jobs in clean energy and 77 jobs in domestic retrofit that needed to be done. So for every one job in fossil fuels, there's 80 jobs in renewable energy and domestic retrofit. That's not looking at the retrofit of our infrastructure, our public buildings, etc., etc. That's just housing. So that's for every one job in fossil fuels, there's 77 that needs to be done if we want to hit our climate targets. And that would transform lives across the United Kingdom. So that's me trying to end on a happy note. But just to kind of stress as well, abolitionists Marianne Kappa and Kelly Hayes said that we live in a society that has been locked into a false sense of inevitability. So our housing system is not broken, it's working as it was designed. Our energy system is not broken, It is working as it was designed to work, but they do not need to be the way that things work, because everything that starts in the human imagination is malleable. So it doesn't matter if it's an economic system, a political system, or an energy system. It doesn't matter if it's a pipeline, a prison barge, or an apartheid state. If it starts in the human imagination, we can change it. So we can rewrite policy, we can change housing systems, we can look after people's basic needs as much as we need to. And I'll wrap up there. I hope I've not overshot by too far.
Thank you very much for that, Scott. Yeah, wow, you really packed a lot of information in that 7 minutes. That's fantastic. Yeah, I hope everyone's written their questions down for the end of the session. Yeah, so thanks for bringing out the links between the building sector, the climate emergency, and really the urgency with which we need to see change there. As well as, yeah, for ending on a hopeful note, despite the UK's outdated and unfit for purpose building and retrofitting policies. I'm gonna now bring in Laura, who's here from the Wynford Residents Union, which is a community union for residents of the Wynford in Glasgow, who stand together as neighbours against anything threatening their community. Currently, the Wynford Residents Union are running an active campaign to save their high flats from being demolished. So that would be the destruction of 600 social homes that they believe could be used for tackling homelessness and housing refugees in Glasgow instead. Laura, great to have you with us.
Thank you so much. I'm just running upstairs because I haven't neighbours just come around. So yeah, thank you so much for that, Scott. That was amazingly informative. I just had a couple of notes on that. The Cedar Court is something that we've referred to constantly, the retrofit, the massively successful retrofit that Scott was talking about there, where your man hasn't had to pay for heating in 2 years. We've referred to that constantly throughout our campaign, and we actually had one of the architects that was involved in the retrofit came and gave us a little walk around and explained a lot of technical things that I didn't understand about conserving heat and energy and airflow and all this stuff. But basically, it's a lovely place to live. We've visited it, we've brought it up a lot. They actually demolished the same identical building, but built at the same time as Cedar Court. They demolished one. So at the same time that Cedar Court was getting retrofitted, which only happened because the local community got together and fought like crazy to stop that demolition from happening. Another one identical to that was actually demolished at the same time. So it just goes to show like how, where there's a will, there's a way, but it really requires the political will for these things to happen. So like COP26, again, our government made all these promises and said that they wanted to retrofit old buildings instead of demolishing them. And again, Cedar Court was pointed to as this wonderful example. And I remember Patrick Harvey taking a bunch of COP26 representatives to take a big photo, had a little photo up at Cedar Court celebrating it and how wonderful it is and how this is an example, to set for the future. Well, he's, it's been like pulling teeth trying to get Patrick Harvey to talk to us for the last 2 years. I've been chasing the man around, like not in a bad way, but just trying to get him to voice some support for retrofit over demolition. But the problem that we're facing, I think, is that the Wheatley Group have become almost all powerful in Scotland. So we're up against what is now the biggest landlord in Europe. They own tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of properties across Scotland, and they're ever increasing their stock. And at the time that the Wheatley Group was set up, the idea for housing associations was going to be that they would be kind of more local based, smaller, community run. The idea was, that there would be kind of some form of, well, I mean, whether that was actually the genuine plan at the time or whether that was just the, PR, the idea was supposed to be that there would be smaller, kind of more independently run things. Instead, what we've seen is increasingly the concentration of all of the public housing stock in the hands of a few increasingly powerful groups, which are then beholden to, you know, the needs of their shareholders, and, you know, the whims of sort of investment bankers, and there's very, very little accountability, obviously, for us as a community, but in terms of our political leaders, nobody wants to come up against these guys because they run Scotland's housing now. But we need to keep making these points, basically, as well as saving 600 homes at a time when we're facing a housing crisis. You know, I don't need to tell you all, but you know, we've been, the Scottish Tenants Organisation has been working a lot with the Homeless Project Scotland, and a lot of freedom of information requests to get the accurate details about the homelessness situation. It's dire, you know, and the situation in temporary accommodation is dire. If you're lucky enough to get it, I'm sure you all saw this week that a mother with a newborn child was refused accommodation. You know, there are 65, or last we checked, there are 65 families with children staying in these hotels. And there's been a lot of deaths in these hotels. There's a lot of drugs and all the rest of it. So we really are at breaking point. You know, people are dying as a result of this crisis. We also have, you know, similarly to in Ireland, although not as badly yet. I don't know if you've been following the situation in Ireland, but we've got essentially race riots. You know, you've got people who are picketing these hotels or any building that they suspect may be used to house asylum seekers in the future, and it's creating a lot of civil unrest. And we've always voiced in this campaign that we're concerned about that. You know, like, we don't want to see an escalation of the situation in Erskine, but that these policies, you know, the housing crisis is being exploited by those groups and will continue to be so in the coming years. And we really need to start housing everybody. Do you know what I mean? We need to stop this separation between people that have lived here longer, people that don't, and all the rest of it. There needs to be one housing system that applies to all people. And it needs a complete overhaul. The homelessness system is in complete collapse, but creating ghettos is not the answer. What we want to see in the Wynford is a mixed community. Part of the beautiful thing about the Wynford is that part of its design from its inception was the idea that you'd have a whole, every type of tenancy would be catered for. So families, single people, and actually the high flats that we're trying to save originally were designed for older people to live in. But the idea that it would be like a self-contained community, and also that it would be social. So you got all these kind of shared green spaces, and it's courtyard living, as it were. We want to see a return to that. We don't want to see these buildings removed and then to be replaced with a new kind of more respectable clientele that are going to be paying like ridiculous mid-market rent prices. For all that the council may, or Wheatley may make promises that there will be social housing in the Wynford post-demolition, that's no guarantee. They've done this time and time again, and that hasn't come to pass. So I'm sorry, I don't know how much time I've got left. I don't want to waffle too much. I thought it was worth mentioning SSE because it's kind of an aspect of the campaign that we've maybe not highlighted enough, is actually that the power plant that we have on the Wynford that was paid for with UK and Scottish government subsidies, whose purpose was to eliminate fuel poverty on the Wynford, is now going to be made far less efficient by the demolition of these 600 homes. So in all likelihood, people's prices are going to go up. And we've heard on the grapevine that now SSE are actually thinking of pulling out of the Wynford. And we always said, why can't we take that energy, which is a byproduct? It's a shared district heating system whereby people get their heat as a byproduct of the energy that is generated, the process. We've always said, well, we should just nationalise that. Frankly, that's money that should never have been in SSE's pockets in the first place. But yeah, that's perhaps a different campaign. But yeah, sorry. I did kind of want to say briefly, sorry, in the next maybe 30 seconds or so, recap what I've found to be helpful in this campaign. Yeah, so The most effective strategies that we've employed have been mounting a legal challenge and demanding an environmental impact assessment, which challenges the legal legitimacy of Wheatley's plans and also exposes the council's poor governance. This is a huge one for me that I've learned in the last couple of years. Freedom of information requests, just use them all the time. They're invaluable because you cannot rely on official representatives to provide you with accurate information or even have any awareness of the situation themselves. Marshalling the expertise of academics, architects, and retrofitting experts has been central to being able to make our case. And our upcoming people's vote, where we're actually going to ballot every household in the Winefords to see what they feel about how they feel about demolition versus retrofit, is going to be unique. It's going to be huge, and it will smash Wheatley's system whereby they manufacture consent for these projects, and it'll set a powerful precedent for communities all over the UK to challenge phony consultations. Apart from that, like the links that we have made with various activist groups, environmental groups, the Radical Housing Network in England, which has provided us a way of connecting with our sister movement down there, and all the left-leaning publications and architecture journals have been amazing. Yeah, it's never been more clear how interlinked our struggles are. Wineford Towers have become a symbol for an alternative way forward. Our campaign is a flashpoint at the intersection of all the major struggles we're facing today: the climate crisis, the housing crisis, the refugee crisis, and the exploitation of the latter by the burgeoning far right, and the hiving off of public infrastructure to investment banks that perpetuate global instability. That's me.
Laura, thank you very much for talking about your struggle against the Wheatley Group and yeah, bringing forth all of those links that your campaign is really intertwined with. Really appreciate the link with refugees and housing homeless people as well. I think it was also really useful to hear your personal your points that your key takeaways from your campaign that you think can help. And yeah, I hope that being here also is a part of your journey to linking up to loads of other groups across the UK. So yeah, thank you for that. Next up, we have Dr. Isabel Braithwaite and Maria Carvalho, who will be talking a little bit about safe ventilation, the health impact of cold homes, and how to organise around these issues. Isabel is a public health doctor currently doing research on housing and health at UCL. Who has worked both as a medical doctor and on public health issues, including climate change and extreme weather, air pollution, and mental health. And Isabel is also involved in advocacy on housing justice issues with MedAct, and who that Maria is from. So Maria is a campaigner and organizer at the health justice charity MedAct, who leads on supporting the Health for a Green New Deal network, which is a community of health workers bringing the health voice to local and national campaigns for climate justice. Isabel and Maria, you have the floor.
Mute. Oh, thanks very much, Amal. And yeah, I'll go first and then hand over to Maria, and I'll try and keep it relatively brief, just a kind of quick whiz through, and then I can answer any questions later. But yeah, this image here on the right is some tenants from basically a group up in Harrow, a place called Crish House, that myself and others in the economic justice group within MedAct, which kind of started focusing in on kind of issues of housing justice, worked with. last year, because as you can see, there were kind of quite severe issues of black mold that were affecting people kind of right throughout this building. And this is quite a pervasive issue in many buildings actually in Harrow, as it is in much of the capital, unfortunately. But for some reasons, Harrow has some particularly bad issues, and we kind of worked with them to raise this with the council and get the council to take legal action. But I guess it's just to kind of bring home the real world ways in which this can be affecting people's health. And this was both adults and children in that building. So we kind of tried to work with them to document the ways in which that was affecting people in their day-to-day, and then kind of collate that and take it. And I think having that health angle was very powerful in that campaign. So that's just kind of like the starting point, and one of the things outside of my kind of PhD work that got me, I suppose, kind of thinking just about how important some of this is. But what we know in terms of the kind of the academic, the research picture is that our housing conditions are a really critical influence on our health, both our physical and mental health. It's just right across the board, really. It's an incredibly important influence on how we feel and on how we can kind of function physically as well. And we know that cold and damp in particular are a very, very important part of that housing health picture. On average, each year, they tend to cause between about 7,000 and 10,000 deaths every year. And you have some years where that's kind of even higher. So the one that Scott mentioned in the talk earlier was a kind of particularly high year, but even just in a regular year, we see thousands of deaths because of the state of our housing system and because of poverty and people not being able to afford to adequately heat their homes. And it's this kind of intersection of inadequately efficient homes and poverty and high energy prices generally are some of those kind of key drivers of fuel poverty, is what's kind of understood in the literature. And each of those are potentially influenceable through policy measures. Damp affects nearly 1 million English homes, and about 2/3 of 1 million are affected by excess cold, as kind of defined in law. And we know that energy efficiency is a really important driver both of cold homes and of fuel poverty, in turn that being linked to damp and mold risks and many, many different health problems. And we know that this is a health inequalities issue. So it's not just spread evenly across the population. Certain people are particularly highly exposed or particularly at risk. So people on lower incomes, ethnic and minority population groups, or minoritized groups, amongst which asylum seekers are kind of particularly severely at risk and often in very, very poor quality housing, often really unable to move anywhere else, very little kind of choice in the matter on that. And people living in privately rented housing have amongst the lowest quality and least efficient housing out of any kind of tenure type, which is often very kind of drafty and poorly efficient and cold. So this is just a few illustrations of some of those inequalities. Resolution Foundation study published last year, focusing on the impacts on young adults, which is amongst the population groups, kind of somewhat counter to, I suppose, the often like popular conception. There certainly is fuel poverty amongst older adults in retirement with kind of low incomes, some of which is somewhat offset by things like the cold weather payments that they may get. But actually young adults in rented housing are very much impacted by this and not immune to the health impacts that can have. And then in terms of kind of ethnic minority groups and people in privately rented or socially rented housing, this kind of tragic case of a 2-year-old who died a couple of years ago, Awab Ishaq, from mold exposure. And that really kind of shone a light on what a major issue this is, and the fact that it can not just cause health issues, but even be fatal, including in young children. And a lot of kind of requirements for change in the social housing sector came out of that. So Awab's law you may have kind of heard about in terms of changes and requirements of social landlords, although the requirements of private landlords are rather behind that, unfortunately. And this kind of comes back to things that Scott touched on, which I thought I'd try not to duplicate too much, but certainly the general picture is that although we really have known about the massive health benefits that could be gained by addressing this and improving the quality of our housing stock, we know that our housing stock is amongst the worst in Europe, and we know that there are huge health benefits and climate benefits and lots of jobs to be gained by addressing this kind of issue and upgrading that housing stock. We've actually known that for many, many years now, and the evidence continues to kind of build up over time. Yet, in the policy kind of context side of that, what's actually happened is kind of in the opposite direction. So you can see here in this graph from the Committee on Climate Change, this real dropping off of annual installations of insulation, housing insulation after 2012, when things like, I think it was the Green Deal at that time was removed in terms of policy support and a lot of the funding with that, with the coalition government at that time. And basically the workforce for that really reduced, and basically the available support just kind of dropped off a cliff. And now we have to kind of try and build back up from this very, very low baseline, which is a real challenge. But this is kind of what the CCC says is going to be needed to kind of get us back on track, is a real rapid ramping up across many different types of insulation, and it needs to be a holistic approach, as kind of Scott outlined. But yeah, that sort of broad context is that we have let this slide despite having a lot of evidence of how needed it is and all the benefits that it could have. So bit of complexity, I suppose, from a kind of health point of view. I've been doing a systematic review looking at the various different health outcomes and impacts. And in terms of a kind of general synopsis of that, there is evidence of in general, a range of physical and mental health harms from living in kind of cold homes or particularly low temperatures, and of health benefiting most of the time when people have retrofits or energy efficiency improvements installed, but with a few kind of caveats to that. So it is actually quite a nuanced picture in some ways. There is some evidence that certain types of insulation are not always associated with health benefits, certainly not in every kind of context. And it's sort of potentially that might be related to whether or not there's adequate ventilation done alongside. It may also be that certain types of insulation are a bit more prone to issues cropping up in terms of damp occurring when they're installed. So cavity wall insulation was something that came up in one of the studies I looked at as potentially a little bit more prone to problems. And we could come back to it in the questions to why that might be. So I think kind of summary message there, the need to ensure that any retrofit measures are tailored to and appropriate for the specific home, rather than a kind of quick and easy one-size-fits-all approach. And also really importantly, that ventilation is prioritized. So certainly from kind of a health point of view, I would say that's really important anyway, as well as in terms of avoiding kind of building related consequences. But it's also important generally from a health point of view in terms of indoor air quality and ensuring that that's good for people. But it's also really important in terms of preventing damp and condensation. But from a kind of holistic health perspective, both the temperature and the ventilation and indoor air quality are really important. So this might mean kind of in campaigning terms, the need to be a little bit more thoughtful and reflexive sometimes, really listening to people and communities and taking account of some of that complexity when we consider what kind of solutions we want to push for. And just thinking about how do we kind of ensure that we don't cause any unintended consequences when we're trying to do the right thing, I think. So some safety kind of considerations. This is not really my area, so kind of hands up on that, but I'll try to kind of give a brief thing, and then potentially if Scott, you have any kind of bits where you think it's in the wrong direction, please do jump in. But sort of general point, I suppose, old insulation that may be in place, but which wouldn't be installed nowadays, may contain things like asbestos. So there's potential where retrofit projects go in that might need to be disturbed potentially. Obviously, there's care needed there because that can be carcinogenic. So there are kind of potential risks there that need to be managed. Then in terms of kind of newer materials, generally safe, as long as installed by trained people and in appropriate ways, but there was the potential for some risk there with some of those fibers if they're inhaled, or particularly kind of for workers if they're coming into a lot of contact with those over time, which from what I kind of understand can all be kind of managed, but I think it's sort of something that needs consideration, and particularly in terms of, you know, things like the spray foam insulation is more of a consideration because there are gases that help it that create the spray that tend to off gas when that's applied, and that there are quite a lot of kind of lung and eye symptoms that can cause. So there's a need to ensure that the people doing that are well trained and also have the appropriate safety measures, that it's well ventilated and so on. So these can be, they're not totally kind of safe materials necessarily, particularly the spray foam insulation. And I think the kind of the training, the safety measures and all of that is really important, particularly from the kind of worker health and safety perspective. And then Scott's touched on this already, the kind of fire safety cladding side of things, when we're thinking about solid walls and external cladding questions, a really big one. So kind of unintended consequences, and especially kind of the drive to just bring down costs and do things cheaply, and that kind of cutting of corners approach, deregulatory kind of policy context, with then, you know, basically hundreds of thousands of people finding themselves, as well as the kind of horrific fact of Grenfell itself, then also the aftermath of over 500,000 people left in buildings that are unsafe and potentially flammable, that is still not at all resolved, and a lot of people excluded from the financial protections put in place, and a lot of mental strain from that. So that, you know, a really complex problem there. So kind of many different, I think, levels and kind of types of risk here, and a lot of them in theory kind of manageable, but all needing quite a lot of care, particularly, you know, in terms of how do you ensure that there's the right regulatory kind of environment, how do you ensure that workers will all have the right kind of training and protections and so on, and potentially that hasn't always kind of happened in the past with some of these things. So can we kind of ensure with our campaigning that you know, worker health and safety, and that, you know, regulation around fire safety, that those are things we perhaps think about as well. I suppose that's perhaps some of the kind of ask. On the question of cavity wall, just to mention this briefly because I kind of touched on it here, that some of the harms with cavity wall insulation might relate to kind of issues of poor policy design and implementation. Now, a lot of people with cavity walls did have suffered kind of significant issues where it's kind of gone wrong, or potentially been installed in places in ways that reflected maybe poor training or not being assessed kind of well, and then done in ways that created issues, and or where it went wrong, they didn't have adequate kind of protections and redress to put it right, and then have been left massively out of pocket, or in homes that are really harming their health, and they can't kind of get out of those, and they can't address the issue. And so Sivali is a kind of campaign group of people affected in this way, who kind of have spoken to MPs and got things into the media about the issues that they've been facing, and some of these kind of individual interest kind of stories, I suppose. which, I've got this screenshot of one of the people affected in this way. So I won't go into the specifics of that, but it's just to flag the kinds of things that can happen when installation does go wrong. And that's certainly not always the case, but it is a potential risk. These are complex interventions, do need care, basically. So yeah, housing is a human right, and I will hand over to Maria for more of the campaign side and to explain Health for Green New Deal's side of this.
Thanks, Izzy. I'll try and be as brief and quick as possible so that we can have more of a discussion and chat as soon as possible. But one of the key questions of today is how we organise ourselves in our communities. And I'm just going to suggest some of the ways that different campaigns can use health, but also how the health community can be part of campaigning for retrofitting. Firstly, using a health framing has been proven to be really powerful when talking about the climate crisis in general. We've definitely seen this in the Health for a Green New Deal. And the reasons for this is that it makes issues more relatable to people's everyday material experiences. People really care about their health and in turn are more motivated to take action. For example, one of the framings that you could approach this issue with is leaky homes and our current energy system are making us ill and costing the NHS. Well, I had millions, but you could argue billions, depends how you measure it. And the responsibility should not be on our health system and our health workers to resolve the impacts of the housing crisis. This is a political issue, and political decisions are being made that are leading to the cost at NHS and the deaths that we are seeing. The solution are not pills. The solution is giving people healthy homes, basically. Secondly, using the health voice can be really powerful. So health workers, and I think nurses in particular, are some of the most trusted professionals in society. So they are, and they're also eyewitnesses to the impacts of things like fuel poverty and so forth and so on. Of course, we need to be conscious about how we do this. I think particularly MedAct and the health workers involved in our network, but we're always trying to critically reflect and try not to replicate systems of privilege and hierarchy that we're trying to dismantle. And it's about using those positions to amplify the voices of affected communities and working alongside and in solidarity with rather than for. Izzy touched on the example in Harrow, where a group of health workers collected data on housing conditions there, and it wasn't just about the mold, it was also about like broken lifts, it was about like the stress that the conditions were putting people in, and making the really clear links to how that was causing ill health. And that was really critical in putting pressure on the council to then prosecute the landlord, which had achieved material changes for those people's lives. But it also helps to build the story that poor housing causes ill health, which can hopefully help to tackle this in a more systemic way. Also, health workers can make public health policy arguments, and I should say not just health workers, anyone can make these arguments, but there's arguments that could be made in a policy context that could be useful. So for example, talking about how retrofitting is a win-win opportunity for policymakers. It addresses energy poverty, the climate crisis, as well as health inequalities. And this is stuff that's already been touched on. But there are immediate health impacts of warmer and well-ventilated homes, as well as longer-term health impacts of tackling the climate crisis, which, as Scott so beautifully put to us, that retrofitting can have such a massive impact on tackling the climate crisis. We can use public health concepts. So there's a concept called proportional universalism, which is really important in public health, which talks about addressing things for everyone, but also targeted. So the benefits of retrofitting need to be available to everyone, but we need to target additional support to those who need it the most. Like, it needs to be something that is accessible and affordable and so forth and so on. And we can make a public health case for this, right? And there's also a health case to be made for a just transition. Again, others have touched on this, but we need to avoid the same damage that was caused to the health and social outcomes in communities who suffered disproportionately during the last big deindustrialization, and sustainable, good quality jobs with decent paying conditions are, we know, and it's proven time and time again, that that's essential for good health. I've got a figure here, but it's much smaller than the one Scott's put to us, so I'm going to leave it. But the figure is that the TUC predict that over 260,000 jobs could be created by retrofitting in social housing alone. So yeah, there's a huge potential there. Yeah, and I just want to end by emphasizing that the health community and the health framing is just a part of how we can organize, and how we can both advocate for retrofitting and also work alongside communities who are doing deeper organizing. And it's a useful and powerful resource, but it's just a small part of the wider organizing and like huge movement that we need around these issues to achieve the changes we want to see. So I'm going to hand it back to Mal and to others to, yeah, so we can have a bit of a Q&A and discuss a bit deeper how we can collectively organize.
Thank you so much, Isabella and Maria. Really, really comprehensive on health there. Thank you. I'm not going to give too much of an outro, just in the interest of time, because we do have a surprise speaker who, well, two, Graham and who's a long-standing member of FPA, who is here with Eddie, who's been working with Graham on the cladding and insulation and many other issues in the Pendleton estate in Salford, where people have experienced a lot of the things that have been discussed and are organising their community. So stay with us also for the discussion afterwards. But before that, Graham and Eddie, we'd love to have you. Welcome. Oh. Hi, Graham and Eddie. We should be able to hear you now.
Hi. Yeah. I've been listening to quite a lot of stuff here. We've been waiting 7 years since Grenfell, and we've still not seen a piece of cladding to be put on. But I think the main thing is stems from corruption, because I believe they're trying to gentrify certain areas and let the private developers take all the prime land in certain areas. Like in our area now, we have Betfred, and he seems to have built everywhere, all over Salford, all new apartments, and never paid a penny in Section 106 payments. Why does he get away with it? A few years ago, we had it tracked down how much was owed to Salford Council, Section 106 payments, and it was £60 million. What could they do with that? But they don't seem to be doing anything to us. They've spent £10 million on fire marshals over the last 7 years, and we've still not got any work done in 7 years. We've just got a works plan just before Christmas again, and there'll be no external works where me and Eddie live until 2025, if it happens then. You know, it's just going on, and we put freedom of information request in, they just ignore them. That's all they do, is they ignore them. We have got a legal team. They've put freedom of information. They've ignored them. So we've been looking into them a bit more depth now, finding out what they've been doing with the money. And we found that all in a circle with the original refurbishment, they was moving from company to company in a circle. All the CEOs, one CEO give 2 million to one company during the PFI. Within 6 months, he was CEO of that company he's just give 2 million to. You know, there's a lot of corruption. And then we tracked another company involved in the PFI, and we found out that they was using a postal address at a disused glass factory in Yorkshire. So, you know, it's corrupt. someone's taking backhanders all over the country for not doing this work. And, you know, we're going to expose them as much as we can, because it can't keep going on. They've got no excuse not to have started any work. Internal work, the original refurbishment, which took 4 or 5 years. Yeah. And we found out that all that work was all rubbish. It weren't up to the specifications. So we've got internal works to happen again. They told us all asbestos had been removed. Now we find out it's not. So we've still got asbestos in the buildings. We've still got unfit fire doors, which was in their own risk assessment since 2017, which they identified they're unfit for use. But we've still got them on our doors. So if we have a fire, no good with the fire doors, because the gap underneath's too big. The smoke will just cover the whole building. But no one seems to do anything against them. They're getting away with it. 7 years we've waited for the doors to be changed.
But how does stuff like this get passed by the fire service and stuff like this?
You know, it's in their own risk assessments, which they've employed someone to do, identifying these issues. Risk to life, moderate. Well, since when has risk to life been moderate? But we're still living in these conditions 7 years on without any work being done whatsoever. And they've wasted £10 million on fire marshals. Their pension pot must be quite well off now, the fire marshals, because all they do is just walk around and let you know there's been a false alarm again. Or they read it newspaper, one or the other. Well, it's the easiest job in the world because they're not doing anything. The council are not being held up. They're just ignoring us because we think that the likes of Betfred and the other private developers have earmarked our land because it's in the centre of Salford and it's prime land. The council had loads of money. When they entered the PFI in the original refurbishment, they went to the government, they owed them £94 million. They then agreed to do PFI if they wiped the debt clear. So the government wiped the £94 million debt to Salford, and then they got set up bogus companies we've been finding out, where they've got one company to do this and they knew that they'd mess up so they could get it back off them for nothing. So they got the properties for nothing back. Then they got someone to do the work. They've messed up, so they get that back. So they've been in a win-win situation. They've saved £94 million and left us in fire traps. You know, how have they got away with it? Liverpool got investigated, the council. Why hasn't Salford Council been investigated? We've been trying to get them investigated because of the Section 106 payments. Why they're not collecting them in? If me or Eddie owed £10 to them, they'd be sending us a letter to go to court. But £60 million, probably gone up to 100 million now, is owed to Salford Council through private developers. And that's why work's not getting done, because behind everyone's back, they're getting little brown envelopes to turn a blind eye, run down the area, buy the land cheap, and then you'll get some posh apartments built up for 350,000 a time. That's why work's not being done in the poorer areas, because they want the land. And councils are in debt. They've run it so poorly over the years. We're suffering because of the way they've run the council. And, you know, we're just going on and on. We've had solicitors around. They come again before Christmas. And she looked at the paperwork we've given her for the directors, what we found out, what had been moving from company to company. And even she said there's something corrupt here. She's going to Government House to try and track it all even further. Because when you've got false companies setting up in a disused glass factory, there's something wrong.
Yeah.
You know, why are they doing things like this? Only because someone's getting some money in their hand. You know, it's not for us, it's for them. And I'll guarantee now, if Labour get in government, Andy Burnham from Manchester the Mayor of Manchester, will become an MP again, and our Salford Mayor will end up being Manchester's Mayor, because it's all money. You know, you just run over everyone, but we're not going to keep standing for it. And I keep exposing all the corruptness of them, and we're going to expose all the directors who's been involved in all this, because someone needs to be brought to justice for it. 7 years down the line, and we've not seen a piece of cladding to go on. We've not seen the fire doors changed. We've not seen anything, have we?
We've made the news.
We've been for Channel 4, we've been on BBC One, we've been on Sky News, we've been all over the social media.
Rip Off Britain with Angela Rippon as well.
And they've got a rougher back than a rhino, Salford Council, because it just seems to be water off the duck's back. They just ignore everyone. They don't want to answer questions. But now we're looking into the money situation and chasing where all this money's gone. The company, what they hired to do the refurb was called Keep Malt. We called him Cheap Malt because he made such a mess of the thing. Council was telling us we're taking them to court. Got kicked out of court.
Yeah, because
they kept changing the plans to make a cheaper option. Not because, well, we just lost it now. But we're now tracking where the money's going, and that's where we'll get them in the end, because that's where the corruptness is. And Dennett and them better watch out, because we're not going to give in until we find it.
I mean, like Scott was on the retrofit, it's a great idea, but the problem is, councils at the end of the day always look for the cheaper option out. And like, who really, at their own mind, wants to refit a building? It's 60-year-old, full of asbestos, full of dodgy concrete, not safe. The cheaper option is to pull it down and sell it.
Well, they owe that much money. They're going to sell our land. We predicted it 7 years ago. They will sell it to someone like Betfred or another private developer to knock these down and move everyone out and get a 300-story flats or something like that up, because he's done it all around Salford up to now. He's got 3 building companies, you know, and he's just building every time there's a bit of land, he's building on it, innit?
Yeah.
You know, he's controlling Salford, and he's getting away with it. And he's not paying any contributions to the Section 106 payments, which is when you get planning permission, you set aside some money for new roads, schools, or whatever in that area. He's paying nothing. He's getting away with it as well.
Well, it was just that school it saved us there. Now it's gone.
Yeah. Now he's doing a favour for the council and building a community hub for 16-year-olds. And he's building it for them.
Friends, I wonder how we can reflect on your experience, Graham and Eddie, and look to collectively on a UK-wide basis or locally draw on the resources of the organisation that's organised this event to effectively bring campaigning leverage to raise these issues. Would the hosts be able to just, as part of the wrap up, be able to help us with any further guidance? I think it would be very valuable to share the slides that, particularly Scott, because it's dense as anything, his suggestions of his slides, but if we're able to gather some collective action, because it's only through collective action that we could maybe face down these iniquities.
There must be other private developers in other areas what are trying to take over the areas.
Yeah, I think Ruth had a point first, the director of Fuel Poverty Action.
Yeah, we had a big conference a couple of years ago that Graham was involved in. It was called Making Green Come True. And it pinpointed it. People from Sivali were involved as well, that you referred to, about the cavity walls. it referred to the fact that very often things look very good on paper, and Graham and Eddie's estate was refurbished with all sorts of consultation and the involvement of the local university, and a kind of a model. And then it was exactly like Grenfell. And after Grenfell happened, the insulation was and cladding was all torn off, and there they are in a northern city with the wind whistling round and nothing on the building to protect them for 7 years. And I know Eddie was having his heating off for not 2 years, I think, but quite a long time. But not because it wasn't needed anymore, just because it was so ineffective and so expensive that he couldn't afford to run it. So, the situation has been absolutely dire there. And that was just one of many situations like that, people who came to speak out about what was happening. And I think it is important for the people who are organizing on retrofitting to actually start helping to publicize some of these harsh realities, as well as the good models that we definitely do need to see. It's not going to help us in the end if we keep pressing for something. I think Isabel touched on this. If we keep pressing for something that actually in reality turns out to be not what it's billed as, or really a gravy train for some private interests, and that is all too common. And it can't be up to people like Graham and Eddie, or indeed up to just Fuel Poverty Action, to do that highlighting. It has to be, people from the climate movement and people from the industry and people who are really concerned to get retrofitting and so on, that actually does what it says it's going to do, have to be doing some of that work and helping with the research. And you may have more access, some of you may have more access to the figures than Graham and Eddie do. I mean, they've been doing a great piece of research. Fuel Poverty Action doesn't have resources for that. We would love to, but we're not that kind of size or a kind of organization. So I think part of what we can help to do is to put people on estates like Wynford or Pendleton, or probably some others here. I think there are some in Lambeth who are here or were here, in touch with people who are working in universities or architects' offices and so on, who can help actually whistleblow, spill the beans, point out what is really happening. And don't miss an opportunity when you speak, that, as Isabel didn't miss the opportunity, but pointed out, what some of the dangers are with the schemes that are coming on, that actually they can end up even making things worse if we're not upfront about it and careful about it and blunt about the, a reality check is what I'm talking about.
Thanks a lot for that, Ruth. Yes, Chia, you want to come in?
Kind of just to reiterate what Ruth is saying as well, about Fuel Poverty Action. So, like, the birth of Fuel Poverty Action it's always been a very grassroots organisation. We have connections. We do work in the grassroots, and we have connections with other people working in the grassroots across the UK. But what makes us kind of different from other organisations is that we also have this relationship with these coalitions of all kinds of, like, charities, NGOs, and like so many different networks. It's huge, and all of us workers have been activists for decades, either in like poverty issues or climate issues. So this network is huge, even though we're a small team. And I'm going to put the email for Fuel Poverty Action in the chat after I finish speaking. So, like, any of you can reach out to us if you need, us to help connect. But it's also interesting, like, as an organization, for our members, we're very much up for supporting, the work you want to see happen. So if you want to be brought together more regularly, if we need to set up a Zoom for people to chat regularly, this could be something we could speak about, and just holding the space for conversations to happen. So please do get in touch with Fuel Poverty Action, and if you're interested in membership as well, to like be a part of this network, do reach out to us and we'll tell you how to get involved.
Thank you very much for that, Chia. We have maybe 5-10 minutes, but let's say 5 minutes for a few questions to our speakers. If anyone had any pressing questions before we close the discussion. I see that there was one question in the chat from Georgina Schuler. I'm curious, what is the problem with cavity insulation? I see, Isabel, you put an answer in the chat, but maybe you can enlighten the whole room.
I mean, Scott might be maybe better placed to reply. It's kind of probably more your area. If you want to go for it.
I can take up even.
There must be private developers.
Or if you want, I can expand upon it just a little bit. Just so, really, just to build upon what Rufus said as well. So with retrofitting, it's not the easiest sell for people, and it's not the most kind of like, it's the least sexy part of climate action. You need to repair the building first. You can't. That a big problem of lots of cavity wall insulation is they haven't repaired the actual fabric of the building. Which, if you've got rain coming into a building, and you fill up the cavity, you've then got rain going into a cavity, and it's total common sense. Like it should be. That's why retrofitting has to be assessed. Lots of these government schemes that you got in the recent years, they will do one thing for you. The assessment might be done, even people are told over the phone, and if a building hasn't actually been kept up to date. So I've known people who, if you want to get certain grants, you have to use your EPC, so your energy performance certificate. Those are not kept up to date. So some people are told you can get this grant if you get cavity wall insulation, and they look at it and someone comes and checks and says, actually, you've had that done, but that's not been updated. So there's not the rigor, things are not kept properly up to date, but it's also, you do need to repair buildings first, because we have a legal kind of structure around housing where there's no guaranteed regular assessment or fixing or upgrade whatsoever. And we only rarely reactively fix things. So we have a culture in kind of business, construction, etc. Things are broken when they fail. Things are repaired when they fail, and when buildings fail, that can be lethal. So we have that's a big policy weak point, as we do not have regularly enforced assessment, surveys, maintenance, upgrade. The things for energy efficiency have been rolled back. But energy efficiency must be paired with maintenance, repair, because that's a big problem with cavity wall insulation. It doesn't apply it depends on when the building was built. There's no one silver bullet method, because the materials that we build buildings from have radically changed in the past 100 years. So saying about before the Second World War, just maybe about 100 materials that would be used. In 2012, there were 55,000 different materials in construction, and 3% of them had been tested against human health or toxicity. So we've got all these unknowns, because construction spends about 0.2% of its profits on our research and development. Research is not being done unless it's being done for private interests. The BRE, British Research Establishment, was privatized. For building materials, you have to pay to have tests done. They are not enforced. They are enforced to get it onto market, to get it insured, so it will not go into a building without certification. But all these healthier materials, all these more environmentally friendly materials, they are very much handicapped because they do not have the big business interests. Most of our building material, lots of installations, like all these foams, the plastics, they're petrochemical based. That's the fossil fuel industry. That is, if we want to stop the fossil fuel industry, we need to clear and we need to divest construction. We need a fossil-free construction industry as fast as possible, because again, form's going to follow fuel. If we have an energy system that's dependent on fossil fuels, we are going to have housing policy that's following that sort of gig. Sorry, that went off tangent, but I hope that answers some of the cavity wall insulation stuff as well. Sorry, I just had to go off there, but yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's That's great, thank you. We have time for maybe just one more question from Chris Hay, and then I'll close the session. Chris.
Cheers. Thanks very much for all the excellent talks. So I'm a doctor that works in older adults in Glasgow, and I had a question for Scott and Maria. Thank you for all the fantastic things that you talked about. I was just wondering if any work has been done in the construction of nursing homes, also in the insulation and protection of nursing homes. I was wondering if you've got any thoughts or data on that.
So off the top of my head, I don't have any data on it, so I'll pass that across.
Maria, did you have anything on that?
No, I'm afraid not.
Sorry.
I think that's something, Chris, we can maybe talk about when you join the Glasgow hub and see if we can find more research on that.
Yes.
Could we take Cathal's question, if that's okay, before we finish?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, hi there. Just a quick one that's probably aimed at Scott as well. Just in terms of trying to persuade councils, housing associations, and things like that from moving towards retrofit as opposed to demolition and whatnot, and using the climate argument, would you be aware of any tools that are quite simple and more importantly free to use in terms of doing life cycle assessments for body carbon? Or
it is, so it's a bit of a hard one, but it's like, because lots of these they're made proprietary and you got to pay for licenses. But if you ask there, I do know that with the Winefords there was EALA Impacts helped with that. So there are people in the industry, like even myself included, we want an offer. So that's something that I can make as an invitation and offering. If there are people wanting to connect with architects for life cycle assessments, I can help with introductions. So if you want that sort of thing, or anyone has an estate or anything like that, you can reach out, because life cycle assessments are becoming more and more rigorous, where if one is carried out by a developer not citing a proper standard in the industry, that instantly falls down. It cannot be held up as being legitimate if they don't follow the standards. So you can pretty much weaponize them doing them badly. And getting them done, if you want to get one done, reach out to myself or the Architects Climate Action Network, and we will look to help connect people with access to these tools to remove that barrier for you. If that's an answer to the question. I'm sorry that there's not making, the industry doesn't make things accessible. Everything is becoming more and more monetized. Everything is like, to access software, prices are being increased and everything. But if people need a life cycle assessment, if you reach out to Fuel Poverty Action, and they can put you in touch with myself.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much.
We'll also be doing a follow-up email to this session, which will include all important links from our speakers. I guess if anyone wants to include any other links to any resources they have, you can get in touch with us and we can maybe put that in the follow-up email as well. So we're just sharing resources as broadly as possible with our networks, and hopefully that's building the movement for retrofit as we go.
Yes, and we can also keep the conversation going on the event discussion board. So, Chris, sorry that we couldn't answer your question. If you also want to post it there, maybe we can then pass it around and find relevant information that you were looking for. But that's all we have time for today. Thanks to everyone for joining, listening, and participating in the session. And thank you again to our speakers for your part in making this so informative. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback on the session, whether positive or negative. Please get in touch at the email address I'm just posting in the chat now. And just to round things up I just want to go through a few things we've been busy fighting for at Fuel Poverty Action. First, you all have until tomorrow to tell Ofgem to get rid of the standing charge. Ofgem is looking for the views of consumers on the energy bills standing charge. And yeah, we believe that standing charges are fundamentally unfair and should be scrapped because no one should have to pay for their right to heat their home. You can sign our template letter and retweet us to spread the word as well. This week also, we have made a lot of noise to support council tenants in Lambeth, in London, that are being threatened with eviction if they can't pay heat network charges that have gone up by over 350%. For heating that historically hasn't even worked properly. There's a little bit that you can listen to here, and also follow the links to support Lambeth residents on heat networks that are affected by this and that are at risk of eviction. And yeah, finally, Fuel Poverty Action is continuing to campaign for energy for all. That is, for everyone to have enough energy free to cover their needs. And as part of that, we have partnered up with the Unite community to launch Unite for Energy for All. So you can join us in our demand for energy for all, which includes ending standing charges and safe insulation. A lot of the things we've spoken to today. That is on the final link that I'm putting here to sign our manifesto. I'm going to change to gallery view just to see everyone here. Be great if you could switch your camera on, give us a wave, turn your microphone on, off, say goodbye, just for the benefit of the recording. And yeah, stay tuned for the next session. We've got something very exciting planned for you next time. Great to see everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Have a lovely dinner.
Bye.
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 Thank you very much. Bye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
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 Bye.